My name is Nathaniel Harrington, and I am the 7th Duke of Westmore. At 29 years of age, I should have been living the life of privilege that my title suggested, but instead, I found myself trapped in a study that felt more like a prison cell on that cold October evening of 1784. The autumn rain hammered against the diamond-paned windows of Harrington Manor, each drop seeming to echo the weight of responsibility that pressed down upon my shoulders like a lead cloak. The papers scattered across my mahogany desk told a story of ruin that would have destroyed lesser men's pride entirely. Gambling debts accumulated by my late father, mortgage payments that grew larger each month, and creditors who were growing impatient with promises of future payments. The Harrington name, which had stood proudly for over 3 centuries, now balanced precariously on the edge of complete disgrace. I picked up one of the letters from my steward, Harold Pembridge, and read it again, though I knew its contents by heart. The numbers seemed to blur together in the candlelight, but their meaning was crystal clear. Without immediate intervention, everything my ancestors had built would be lost within 6 months. The estate, the tenants who depended on us for their livelihoods, the servants who had served my family faithfully for generations, all would be cast into uncertainty. Harold knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission, as was his way after 30 years of service to my family. His weathered face bore the same expression of grim determination that had carried us through my father's worst excesses and my mother's prolonged illness. He carried with him a leather portfolio that I knew contained what he believed to be our salvation. "Your Grace," he said, settling his considerable frame into the chair opposite my desk. "I believe I have found a solution to our difficulties." His voice carried that particular tone that suggested I would not entirely appreciate what he was about to propose. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face in the flickering candlelight. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees that lined our drive, creating shadows that danced across the walls like specters of past Harringtons who had managed their affairs more successfully than I. "Tell me, Harold," I said, though part of me already knew what he would suggest. In our society, there were only so many ways for a nobleman to acquire large sums of money quickly, and most of them involved marriage. He opened his portfolio with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life managing other people's disasters. "The Ashford family, Your Grace. Baron Edgar Ashford finds himself in circumstances similar to our own, but with one significant difference." He paused, allowing me to process the implications. I had heard whispers about the Ashfords at various social gatherings over the past year. The Baron had lost heavily in some questionable investments in the Americas, and his family's reputation had suffered accordingly. But Harold's mention of a significant difference suggested there was more to their story than mere financial embarrassment. "Baron Ashford has a sister," Harold continued, "Lady Cordelia Ashford, who remains unmarried despite being well into her 4th season. She possesses a substantial dowry in the form of fertile lands in Yorkshire, lands that would more than satisfy our immediate creditors and provide ongoing income for the estate." The way he phrased it, with careful diplomatic language, told me everything I needed to know about why Lady Cordelia remained unmarried. In our world, a woman of good family who had not secured a husband by her 4th season was either impossibly particular, impossibly difficult, or possessed of some impediment that made her less desirable to potential suitors. "What manner of impediment?" I asked directly, having learned long ago that Harold's euphemisms often concealed uncomfortable truths. Harold shifted in his chair, a gesture that in 30 years I had learned meant he was about to deliver news I would not welcome. "Lady Cordelia suffered from a severe fever as a child, Your Grace. It left her with certain physical limitations. She walks with a pronounced limp and tires easily. Additionally, she is said to be of a melancholy disposition, preferring books and solitude to social gatherings." I stared into the fire that crackled in the hearth, watching the flames consume the oak logs that had been cut from trees planted by my great-grandfather. The irony was not lost on me that I was being asked to sacrifice my romantic ideals on the altar of family responsibility, just as those trees had been sacrificed to warm a house that might not belong to my family much longer. "The Baron is desperate to secure his sister's future," Harold continued, his voice gentler now, as if he understood the weight of what he was asking. "He would accept a swift engagement and marriage with minimal ceremony. The dowry would be transferred immediately upon the signing of the marriage contract." I rose from my desk and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cold glass. The grounds of Harrington Manor stretched out before me in the darkness, invisible now but as familiar as my own heartbeat. Every tree, every path, every stone wall represented generations of my family's stewardship. Could I truly be the Duke who let it all slip away because I harbored romantic notions about marrying for love? The truth was, I had always imagined that when I married, it would be to a woman who challenged me intellectually, who shared my interests in literature and philosophy, who could be a true partner in both the management of the estate and the raising of children. I had pictured quiet evenings spent in comfortable conversation, shared laughter over private jokes, and the kind of deep affection that grows between two people who genuinely understand and appreciate each other. But such dreams seemed selfish when weighed against the welfare of dozens of tenant families and the legacy of my ancestors. How many young men in my position had the luxury of marrying for love? How many had to make similar sacrifices for the greater good of their families and dependents? "Have you spoken with Baron Ashford directly?" I asked, turning back to face Harold. "I have sent inquiries through appropriate channels, Your Grace. The Baron has expressed cautious interest, provided you would be willing to meet with Lady Cordelia and find her acceptable." The phrase "find her acceptable" struck me as particularly cold, reducing what should have been the most important decision of both our lives to a business transaction. Yet I understood the realities of our situation. This was not a love match being proposed, but a practical alliance that would benefit both families. "What do you know of her character, beyond her physical limitations and supposed melancholy?" I asked, finding myself curious despite the transactional nature of the arrangement. Harold consulted his notes, though I suspected he knew the information by heart. "She is said to be well educated, having been tutored privately due to her difficulties with social situations. The local vicar speaks highly of her charitable work among the poor families in the village near Ashford Hall. She has never been involved in any scandal, and those who know her describe her as gentle and thoughtful, though reserved." These details painted a picture of a woman who had perhaps been forced into a contemplative life by circumstances beyond her control. I found myself wondering what dreams she might be sacrificing in accepting this arrangement, what hopes for happiness she might be setting aside to secure her family's financial stability. The rain had intensified, now driving against the windows with a force that seemed to echo my own internal turmoil. I thought of my parents' marriage, which had begun as a similar arrangement but had grown into genuine affection and respect over the years. Perhaps such a foundation was not the worst beginning for a union, even if it lacked the passionate romance celebrated in the novels that lined my library shelves. "Arrange a meeting," I said finally, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But I want to meet Lady Cordelia properly, not simply inspect her like livestock at market. If we are both to sacrifice our romantic ideals for family duty, then we deserve at least the courtesy of honest conversation before we commit our lives to each other." Harold nodded, making notes in his careful script. "Shall I suggest a visit to Ashford Hall, Your Grace? It would allow you to see the family in their own environment, and perhaps provide Lady Cordelia with some measure of comfort, being on familiar ground." I agreed to this suggestion, though part of me wondered if I was making the right choice. As Harold gathered his papers and prepared to leave, I found myself staring once more into the fire, wondering what kind of man I was becoming. Was I a practical nobleman making a sensible decision for the good of all concerned? Or was I a coward, too afraid of financial ruin to fight for something better? Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to make a choice that went against your heart for the sake of others? The weight of such decisions can feel overwhelming, and sometimes we must trust that duty and honor will guide us toward outcomes we cannot yet see. 3 days later, I found myself traveling the muddy roads toward Ashford Hall, my carriage wheels churning through puddles that reflected the gray November sky above. The countryside looked as bleak as my mood, with bare trees stretching skeletal branches toward clouds that promised more rain. I had spent those 3 days trying to prepare myself mentally for what lay ahead, but no amount of preparation could ease the knot of anxiety that had taken residence in my chest. Harold had arranged the visit with characteristic efficiency, sending word ahead that I would arrive in the early afternoon for tea and conversation. The formality of it all seemed absurd, given that we were essentially negotiating the sale of two people's futures, but I understood the necessity of maintaining proper appearances. Society demanded its rituals, even in the most desperate circumstances. Ashford Hall came into view as we rounded a bend in the drive, and I was struck immediately by how different it appeared from my own estate. Where Harrington Manor maintained an air of faded grandeur, Ashford Hall seemed to wear its decline more openly. Several windows on the upper floors were boarded shut, the gardens showed clear signs of reduced maintenance, and the overall impression was of a house slowly surrendering to time and circumstance. My driver brought the carriage to a stop before the main entrance, where a single servant waited to greet us. The absence of the usual retinue of footmen and grooms spoke volumes about the family's reduced circumstances. I stepped down from the carriage, straightened my coat, and tried to compose myself for what would undoubtedly be an awkward encounter. The servant, an elderly man with the bearing of someone who had once overseen a much larger staff, led me through halls that echoed with emptiness. Dust covers draped furniture in several rooms we passed, and I noticed how many paintings had been removed from the walls, leaving only faded rectangles to mark where they had once hung. The financial desperation here was even more advanced than my own family's situation. Baron Edgar Ashford waited for me in what had once been a magnificent drawing room but now felt cavernous with its sparse furnishing. He was a man in his early 50s, with the kind of worn appearance that comes from prolonged stress and worry. His clothes were well-tailored but showed signs of age, and his handshake carried the desperate firmness of someone trying to project confidence he did not feel. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that he tried to disguise with formal politeness. "I cannot express how honored we are to receive you at Ashford Hall." I murmured appropriate pleasantries while studying his face, trying to gauge the depth of his desperation. It was clear that this potential marriage represented more than financial convenience for him. It likely meant the difference between his sister having any future security at all or facing complete destitution. "Lady Cordelia will join us shortly," he continued, gesturing toward chairs arranged near a fire that provided more smoke than warmth. "She is, I confess, somewhat nervous about this meeting. She has had little experience with such formal social situations." This admission told me more about Lady Cordelia's condition than Harold's careful inquiries had revealed. If she had been kept from formal social situations, her physical limitations were likely more significant than I had been led to believe, or her family had made the decision to shield her from potential embarrassment or rejection. We settled into conversation about neutral topics while we waited. The Baron spoke of local agricultural conditions and recent political developments, but I could see his attention was divided, his eyes frequently moving toward the door as if willing his sister to appear. The longer we waited, the more apparent it became that Lady Cordelia's reluctance to join us was significant. When she finally appeared in the doorway, I understood immediately why her family had been protective of her social exposure. Lady Cordelia Ashford was not the pitiful invalid I had been expecting, but neither was she the typical society beauty who might have secured a more advantageous marriage under normal circumstances. She walked with a pronounced limp, favoring her left leg significantly, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite physical limitations. But what struck me most forcefully were her eyes. They were a remarkable shade of green, intelligent and alert, taking in every detail of the room and my reaction to her appearance with an assessment that seemed almost scientific in its precision. This was not a woman who was unaware of her circumstances or naive about the nature of this meeting. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that she managed with practiced grace despite her physical challenges. "I apologize for keeping you waiting." Her voice was soft but clear, with an undertone of resignation that suggested she had already accepted whatever outcome this meeting might produce. The Baron quickly moved to guide her to a chair, his solicitude making her stiffen slightly in what I interpreted as embarrassment at being treated like an invalid. "Please do not apologize," I said, rising to acknowledge her presence. "I am grateful for the opportunity to meet you properly." She gave me a look that suggested she found my formal politeness somewhat amusing, though she was too well-bred to comment on it directly. As she settled into her chair, I noticed how she arranged her skirts to minimize the evidence of her physical limitation, a gesture so automatic it spoke to years of practice. The Baron attempted to facilitate conversation, asking about my journey and commenting on the weather, but the artificial nature of the situation hung over us like a cloud. We were three people pretending that this was a normal social call, when we all knew it was essentially a business negotiation with Lady Cordelia as the primary commodity being discussed. "Perhaps," Lady Cordelia said suddenly, addressing me directly for the first time, "we might speak more freely about the nature of this visit. I believe we would all benefit from honesty rather than elaborate courtesy." Her directness surprised both her brother and me. The Baron looked alarmed at her abandonment of social niceties, but I found myself appreciating her practical approach to an inherently awkward situation. "You are quite right," I said, meeting her steady gaze. "We are here to discuss the possibility of a marriage arrangement that would benefit both our families financially. I believe we all understand the practical considerations involved." She nodded slowly, and I saw something that might have been relief cross her features. "Then perhaps you would like to know what such an arrangement would mean to me, and I might learn what you would expect from a wife who comes to you under these circumstances." The Baron started to protest, clearly uncomfortable with such blunt discussion. But Lady Cordelia held up a hand to silence him with an authority that suggested she was accustomed to managing her own affairs despite her family's protective instincts. "I am aware that my physical limitations make me an unusual choice for a man of your station," she continued, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of pain that she was trying to suppress. "I also understand that your estate requires the financial resources that would come with my dowry. If we are to consider this alliance, I believe we should be clear about what each of us brings to the arrangement and what we might expect from it." Her frankness was both refreshing and heartbreaking. Here was a young woman who had clearly spent considerable time thinking about her limited options and had arrived at a pragmatic acceptance of her circumstances that spoke to both intelligence and inner strength. Yet I could see the cost of such practicality in the careful control she maintained over her emotions. "What would you expect from such a marriage?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the fire as if seeking answers in the flames. "Respect," she said finally, "and the freedom to contribute to the welfare of your tenants and estate in whatever ways my abilities allow. I would not expect affection or romance, but I would hope for civility and perhaps, in time, companionship. The sadness in her voice when she dismissed the possibility of affection struck me more forcefully than I had expected. Here was a young woman who had clearly given up on the dreams that most people her age took for granted, accepting a future that offered security but little hope of happiness. "And what would you expect from me?" she asked, turning the question back to me with that same direct gaze. I found myself struggling to answer honestly. What did I expect from a wife I was marrying for financial convenience? The traditional responses about companionship and shared responsibility seemed hollow given the circumstances of our meeting. "I would expect honesty," I said eventually, "and partnership in managing the responsibilities that come with our positions. I would hope that we might find ways to make each other's lives more pleasant, even if our beginning is not conventional." She studied my face with an intensity that made me feel as though she were reading my character like a book. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal calculation, because she nodded slightly and turned to her brother. "Edgar, perhaps you could show His Grace the estate documents while I arrange for more tea." It was clearly a dismissal, giving her brother the opportunity to discuss financial details while she removed herself from the more mercenary aspects of the negotiation. As she rose to leave, I found myself watching the careful way she moved, the dignity she maintained despite her obvious physical discomfort. The Baron and I spent the next hour reviewing the specifics of the dowry arrangement, the transfer of properties, and the timeline for a potential wedding. The numbers were indeed sufficient to resolve my immediate financial crisis and provide ongoing stability for the estate. From a practical standpoint, the marriage made perfect sense for both parties. But as I prepared to leave Ashford Hall that evening, I found myself thinking not about financial projections but about the resigned sadness I had seen in Lady Cordelia's remarkable green eyes. Over the following 3 weeks, I found myself returning to Ashford Hall more frequently than strict propriety required. What had begun as dutiful courtship visits gradually transformed into something I had not anticipated. Genuine curiosity about the woman I was expected to marry. Lady Cordelia Ashford proved to be far more complex and intriguing than our first awkward meeting had suggested. Our second encounter took place in the estate's gardens, where I discovered her tending to a collection of late-blooming roses that most gardeners would have abandoned to the approaching winter. She worked with careful precision, her movements economical but effective, deadheading spent blooms and preparing the plants for the harsh months ahead. When she noticed my approach, she straightened slowly, using her gardening fork as a subtle support. "Your Grace," she said, pulling off her worn leather gloves with hands that bore small cuts from thorns. "I did not expect you so early in the day. I hope you do not mind the intrusion," I replied, genuinely concerned that I had interrupted something important to her. Harold mentioned that early afternoon visits might be preferable, but I found myself eager to escape the confines of my study. She gave me a look that suggested she understood exactly what kind of confinement my study represented. "The account books can be rather oppressive company," she said with a slight smile that transformed her serious features entirely. "I find that roses are much more forgiving conversation partners." This glimpse of humor surprised me. During our first meeting, she had been so carefully controlled, so focused on the practical aspects of our arrangement, that I had not expected wit or lightness from her. But here, in her element among the plants she obviously loved, she seemed more relaxed and natural. "Do you spend much time in the gardens?" I asked, moving closer to examine her work. The roses she had been tending were indeed remarkable, their blooms fuller and more vibrant than I would have expected so late in the season. "Most days when the weather permits," she admitted, then added with a self-deprecating tone. "It is one of the few activities where my limitations do not significantly hinder my effectiveness. Plants do not require dancing or lengthy walks or any of the other accomplishments expected of ladies in society." Her casual reference to her physical challenges struck me as both matter-of-fact and tinged with regret. I found myself wondering what other activities she might have enjoyed if circumstances had been different, what dreams she might have pursued if her options had not been so constrained by both her condition and her family's financial situation. "These roses are exceptional," I said, touching one of the deep red blooms. "You clearly have considerable skill." She looked pleased by the compliment, though she tried to dismiss it. "I have had extensive time to practice, and gardening texts are readily available even to those who cannot participate in more social forms of education." This comment revealed more about her isolation than she might have intended. While other young women her age had been attending balls and house parties, expanding their social connections and romantic possibilities, she had been teaching herself botany and horticulture from books, finding solace in activities that could be pursued alone. Our conversation continued as we walked slowly through the garden paths, her pace necessarily measured but our discussion ranging freely across topics I had not expected her to engage with so knowledgeably. She spoke of agricultural innovations she had read about, political developments that might affect local farming conditions, and philosophical questions about the responsibilities of landowners to their tenants. "You seem surprised by my interests," she observed after I had commented on her insights about estate management. I confess I am, I admitted. Most ladies of my acquaintance do not concern themselves with such practical matters. Most ladies of your acquaintance have not been required to consider how they might contribute meaningfully to a household beyond ornamental value, she replied with a directness that was becoming characteristic of her conversation. Her comment made me realize how little I had considered what role she might play beyond resolving my financial difficulties. I had been so focused on the transactional aspects of our potential marriage that I had not thought seriously about what kind of partnership we might develop or how her obvious intelligence and practical nature might actually benefit the estate's management. During my third visit, she surprised me further by asking to see some of the books from her late father's library, which had been one of the few collections not sold to pay debts. When I arrived, she had several volumes spread across a table in what had once been the family's formal dining room, but now served as her private study space. I hope you do not think it presumptuous, she said, gesturing toward the books. But I thought if we are to be married, you might wish to know something of my intellectual interests beyond gardening. The volumes she had selected revealed the breadth of her self-education, works on natural philosophy, political economy, poetry, and even several texts on agricultural improvement that I recognized from my own library. Her marginalia filled the pages, thoughtful annotations and questions that demonstrated not just careful reading but genuine engagement with complex ideas. You have read Malthus, I said, picking up one of the political economy texts. Among others, she replied, then added with a slight smile. I may not be able to dance, but I can certainly think. Her comment was delivered lightly, but I heard the underlying frustration of a sharp mind that had been given little opportunity for intellectual exchange. Most of the people in her limited social circle would have been either uninterested in or intimidated by her obvious intelligence, leaving her to pursue her studies in isolation. We spent that afternoon discussing agricultural theory and political philosophy, and I found myself genuinely impressed by the sophistication of her thinking. She had clearly used her enforced solitude productively, developing knowledge and insights that many gentlemen of my acquaintance would have envied. Yet I could also see the loneliness behind her intellectual achievements, the hunger for meaningful conversation that her circumstances had denied her. It was during our fourth meeting that I began to understand the true depth of her character. We had planned to walk in the village, but a sudden November storm had driven us to seek shelter in the local church. Inside the small stone building, we encountered several families from the village who had come seeking the same refuge from the weather. What I witnessed next revealed more about Lady Cordelia than weeks of formal conversation could have accomplished. She knew each family by name, inquired after specific children by name, and listened with genuine concern to their problems and worries. When young Mrs. Fletcher mentioned that her infant son had been feverish, Lady Cordelia immediately began discussing remedies and offering to send herbs from her garden. Lady Cordelia has been a blessing to our community, the elderly vicar told me quietly while she was occupied with the children. Despite her own challenges, she never fails to help where she can. Many families have benefited from her knowledge of healing herbs and her willingness to share what resources she has. Watching her interact with these villagers, I saw a side of her personality that had been hidden during our more formal encounters. Here was warmth, genuine care for others, and a natural authority that came from consistent kindness rather than social position. The children clearly adored her, gathering around her chair and chattering excitedly about their small concerns and achievements. When we finally returned to Ashford Hall that evening, I found myself seeing her differently. The careful reserve she maintained with me was not coldness or lack of feeling, but rather the protective barrier of someone who had learned not to expect too much from others. With people she trusted, people who accepted her as she was, she revealed herself to be warm, intelligent, and deeply compassionate. That night, as I lay in the guest room the Baron had insisted I use rather than travel home in the storm, I found myself thinking not about financial arrangements or family obligations, but about the woman I was expected to marry. Lady Cordelia Ashford was not the resigned invalid I had anticipated, nor was she simply a solution to my financial problems. She was a complete person with her own dreams, fears, and desires, someone who had learned to find meaning and purpose despite circumstances that would have defeated a lesser spirit. But I also sensed something else about her, something she kept carefully hidden beneath her practical acceptance of our arrangement. There was a sadness in her eyes that went beyond disappointment about her physical limitations or frustration with her social isolation. It was the particular sadness of someone who had given up on something precious, someone who had made a sacrifice that cost more than she was willing to admit. As the storm continued to rage outside my window, I wondered what dreams Lady Cordelia had abandoned to accept this marriage of convenience, and whether I was worthy of the trust she was placing in me by agreeing to share her life with a man who was, essentially, a stranger motivated primarily by financial necessity. The thought troubled me more than I had expected, and I realized that my feelings about this arrangement were becoming far more complicated than simple gratitude for a practical solution to my problems. The night before our wedding was to be announced publicly. I found myself unable to sleep. The arrangements had been finalized with characteristic efficiency, A simple ceremony would take place in 3 weeks' time, the dowry transfer would occur immediately afterward, and Lady Cordelia would move to Harrington Manor as my Duchess. Everything had been settled according to the practical considerations that had brought us together, yet I felt increasingly unsettled about the entire arrangement. I had grown genuinely fond of Cordelia during our courtship visits, and I believed she had developed some measure of comfort with me as well. Our conversations had become easier, more natural, and I had seen glimpses of warmth and humor that suggested we might indeed find companionship in our marriage. But something continued to trouble me about her careful composure, her resigned acceptance of circumstances that should have been cause for celebration, even if modest celebration. Unable to bear the confines of my chamber any longer, I decided to take a walk in the night air. The November cold was sharp and clean, with a clarity that made the stars seem unusually bright above the sleeping countryside. I had walked perhaps half a mile when I realized my steps had unconsciously taken me in the direction of Ashford Hall. The house was dark except for a single light visible in what I knew to be the library window. As I approached the manor, my attention was drawn to movement in the garden behind the main house. Someone was walking among the rose beds where I had first seen Cordelia working. The figure moved with the careful, measured gait that I had learned to recognize, and even in the moonlight, I knew it was her. She had not seen me, and something about her posture, her movements, suggested this was a private moment I was not meant to witness. She carried something in her hands, papers of some kind, and as I watched from the shadows near the garden wall, she knelt beside the dying rose bush where we had first spoken weeks ago. What happened next would remain etched in my memory forever. She began tearing the papers she carried, methodically destroying what appeared to be several sheets of correspondence. The pieces scattered in the slight breeze, some catching on the bare thorns of the roses, others drifting onto the frost-covered ground like fallen petals. My first instinct was to retreat, to respect her privacy and return to my own troubled thoughts. But as I turned to leave, a gust of wind carried several of the torn fragments directly to my feet. Almost without conscious thought, I bent to collect them, thinking to prevent them from littering the garden she obviously cared for so deeply. It was only when I held the pieces in my hands that I realized what I was looking at. The handwriting was unmistakably Cordelia's, her elegant script visible even in the moonlight. The fragments contained words that made my heart constrict with sudden understanding. My dearest Thomas, cannot ask you to share, sacrifice we must both make, and most devastating of all, love you with all my heart. The implications struck me with the force of a physical blow. Cordelia was in love with someone else, someone named Thomas whom she was giving up to marry me. This was not simply a practical arrangement for her, as it was for me, but a genuine sacrifice of her heart's desire for the sake of family duty and financial necessity. I stood frozen in the shadows, torn between the urge to confront her immediately and the knowledge that I was witnessing something intensely private. As I watched, she gathered the remaining fragments from around the rose bush, her movements careful and methodical even as I could see her shoulders shaking in what I realized were silent sobs. The sight of her grief struck me harder than I could have anticipated. Here was a woman I had grown to respect and genuinely care for, someone whose intelligence and kindness had begun to make me believe our marriage might offer real companionship and perhaps even affection. Yet she was sacrificing a love match to marry me, just as I was sacrificing my romantic ideals to secure her dowry. But her sacrifice seemed so much greater than mine. I had never been in love, had never formed the kind of deep attachment that would make marriage to another person feel like a betrayal of my heart's deepest longings. Cordelia was giving up not just abstract romantic possibilities, but an actual, specific love for a man who clearly returned her feelings strongly enough that she felt compelled to write to him of her decision. When she finally rose and walked slowly back toward the house, I remained hidden until I was certain she was safely inside. Then I carefully collected every fragment of the torn letters I could find in the moonlight, driven by an impulse I did not fully understand. Perhaps I hoped to learn more about the man she loved, or perhaps I simply could not bear the thought of her private words being scattered and trampled. Back in my chamber, I spread the fragments on my writing desk like pieces of a puzzle. The moonlight streaming through my window provided enough illumination to make out most of the words, and as I painstakingly reconstructed portions of her letters, the full scope of her sacrifice became clear. Thomas was evidently a physician, the son of a country doctor, with no fortune or social position to recommend him beyond his own character and professional skill. Cordelia's letter spoke of long conversations about medical texts, shared interests in natural philosophy, and a deep intellectual and emotional connection that had developed over what appeared to be several years of acquaintance. Most heartbreaking were the passages where she explained to him why she could not accept what seemed to have been a proposal of marriage. She wrote of her family's financial desperation, her responsibility to secure her brother's future, and her conviction that marrying a man of modest means would condemn them both to poverty and social exile. Her love for him was evident in every line, but so was her determination to do what she believed was right for everyone involved. One fragment that I was able to reconstruct almost completely read, "You deserve a wife who can come to you freely, without the burden of family obligations or physical limitations that would hinder your professional advancement. I cannot ask you to sacrifice your future for someone who can offer so little in return." The pain in those words was unmistakable, as was the fundamental misunderstanding that seemed to underlie her decision. She believed herself to be a burden, someone whose love would harm rather than help the man who wanted to marry her. She had convinced herself that rejecting him was an act of kindness, when it was clearly causing them both tremendous suffering. As I sat surrounded by the fragments of her broken heart, I found myself facing a moral dilemma I had not anticipated when I agreed to this arrangement. Cordelia was entering our marriage believing she was making a purely practical decision, accepting financial security in exchange for giving up love. But I now understood that she was sacrificing far more than I had realized, and that my acceptance of her dowry was making me complicit in the destruction of her chance for genuine happiness. The question that tormented me for the rest of that sleepless night was whether I had any right to go through with a marriage that I now knew was costing her so dearly. Could I accept her sacrifice in good conscience, knowing that she was giving up a man she truly loved to secure my financial stability? Was it fair to either of us to begin a marriage built on such profound inequality of feeling and sacrifice? But even as I wrestled with these questions, I realized there was another, perhaps more disturbing possibility to consider. What if Cordelia's feelings for me were not merely resigned acceptance, but active deception? What if her growing warmth during our courtship had been carefully calculated performance, designed to make me believe we might find happiness together while she secretly mourned the loss of her true love? The thought made me feel somehow betrayed, though I recognized the unfairness of such a reaction. She had never promised me love or even affection, had been clear from our first meeting that she expected nothing beyond respect and civility. If she had learned to seem content with our arrangement while privately grieving, that was perhaps evidence of her strength and consideration for my feelings rather than any kind of duplicity. Yet I could not escape the realization that everything I thought I knew about our relationship had been fundamentally altered by what I had witnessed in the garden. The woman I was to marry in 3 weeks was not the resigned but willing partner I had believed her to be, but a heartbroken sacrifice to family duty who was trying to make the best of circumstances that were causing her genuine anguish. As dawn began to break through my chamber windows, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I could not marry Cordelia without understanding the full truth of her situation, and I could not allow her to sacrifice her happiness without at least knowing that she had other options. Whatever the consequences for my own financial difficulties, I owed her the honesty she had shown me throughout our acquaintance, and the opportunity to make her choice with complete knowledge of what alternatives might exist. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story of duty versus desire, subscribe to hear how this revelation changes everything. The choice I was about to make would alter not just my own fate, but the future of everyone involved in this tangled web of love, sacrifice, and family obligation. The next morning brought with it a resolution that felt both terrifying and liberating. I would confront Cordelia directly about what I had discovered, regardless of the consequences for our arrangement or my family's financial future. She deserved honesty, and I could not begin a marriage built on my knowledge of her secret sacrifice without giving her the opportunity to reconsider her choice. I arrived at Ashford Hall earlier than usual, my heart hammering against my ribs as I requested a private audience with Lady Cordelia. The Baron looked surprised but pleased by what he interpreted as eager bridegroom behavior, and he readily agreed to leave us alone in the drawing room where we had first met. Cordelia entered wearing a dress of deep blue that complemented her remarkable eyes, but I could see the signs of her sleepless night in the shadows beneath them. She moved with her usual careful grace, settling into her chair with the composed demeanor that had become familiar to me over our weeks of acquaintance. "Your Grace," she said with a slight smile that did not quite reach her eyes, "you seem unusually serious this morning. I hope there are no difficulties with the arrangements for next week." The irony of her concern for my welfare, when I now knew the depth of her own sacrifice, made my chest tight with emotion. I pulled the carefully reconstructed fragments of her letters from my coat pocket, placing them on the small table between us. Her face went completely white as she recognized what I held. For a moment, I thought she might faint, but instead she straightened in her chair, meeting my eyes with a dignity that made my admiration for her grow even stronger. "You were in the garden last night," she said. Not a question but a statement delivered with remarkable calm given what my discovery must mean to her. I admitted. "I could not sleep, and my walk took me past your estate. I saw you destroying letters, and the wind scattered some fragments at my feet. I did not intend to invade your privacy, but once I realized what they contained, I felt I could not proceed with our marriage without addressing what I had learned." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap with the careful stillness I had learned indicated she was struggling with strong emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but barely above a whisper. "What do you intend to do with this knowledge?" "That depends entirely on you," I said, leaning forward earnestly. Cordelia, I had no idea that you were sacrificing a genuine attachment to marry me. If you truly love this Thomas, if he returns your feelings and would marry you despite your family's financial difficulties, then perhaps we can find another solution to both our problems. She looked at me with something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. And what of your creditors? Your estate? The tenants who depend on your family's solvency? Are you prepared to lose everything for the sake of my romantic sentiments? Her question cut to the heart of my own dilemma, but over the long night of reflection, I had reached a conclusion that surprised me with its certainty. I have been thinking about that question for hours, I said, and I have realized that I cannot build my family's future on the destruction of your happiness. There must be other ways to address my financial difficulties, ways that do not require you to sacrifice the man you love. Tears began to slip down her cheeks, though she tried to maintain her composure. You do not understand, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Thomas did propose to me. He offered to marry me despite having nothing to offer but his profession and his devotion. But I could not condemn him to poverty and social exile. His medical practice would suffer if he married so far above his station, especially to someone with my physical limitations. I would destroy his future just as surely as my family's debts would destroy ours. The pain in her voice was heartbreaking, but I could also hear the flawed reasoning that had led her to this sacrifice. Has Thomas expressed these concerns himself? Or are you making assumptions about what he can and cannot handle? She looked startled by the question. I am trying to protect him from making a decision he would later regret. By making that decision for him without consulting his wishes, I said gently. Cordelia, you are assuming that your love would be a burden to him rather than a gift. Perhaps you should allow him to judge for himself what sacrifices he is willing to make for your happiness. The idea seemed to stun her. She sat in silence for several minutes, clearly wrestling with concepts she had not fully considered. Finally, she looked at me with an expression of bewildered hope. But what of your situation? What of our family's arrangements? You need my dowry to save your estate. I had given considerable thought to this problem as well. I will find other solutions. Perhaps I can sell some of the London properties my father acquired, or negotiate longer terms with the creditors. The estate may have to operate more modestly for a time, but it will survive. I will not build my future on the ruins of your heart. She began to cry in earnest then, the careful control she had maintained for weeks finally cracking under the weight of emotions she had tried to suppress. I moved to kneel beside her chair, offering my handkerchief and what comfort I could provide without overstepping the bounds of propriety. Why would you do this? She asked through her tears. Why would you sacrifice your security for someone you barely know? The question forced me to examine my own motivations more closely than I had yet attempted. Because over these weeks of knowing you, I have come to care about your happiness more than my own convenience, I said, surprised by the truth of the admission. I have grown genuinely fond of you, Cordelia, fond enough to want you to have the chance at the love you deserve rather than settling for the practical arrangement I can offer. She looked at me with wonder, as if I had revealed something impossible. I never expected kindness from this marriage, she said softly. I thought you would be satisfied with a wife who managed your household efficiently and caused you no trouble. I never imagined you would concern yourself with my feelings. Her words revealed how little she expected from the people in her life, how accustomed she had become to being treated as a burden rather than a person deserving of consideration and care. The realization made me more determined than ever to ensure she had the opportunity to choose her own future. What would you like to do? I asked. If you could choose freely, without concern for family obligations or financial considerations, what would you choose? For the first time since I had known her, Cordelia allowed herself to consider a question without immediately calculating the practical constraints. Her face softened with longing as she contemplated possibilities she had forced herself to abandon. I would choose Thomas, she said simply. I would choose love and partnership and the chance to help him with his medical work. I would choose a life where I could use my knowledge of healing herbs to help his patients, where my education would be valued rather than seen as an oddity. I would choose happiness over security. Her answer came without hesitation, confirming what I had already suspected from the torn letters. Whatever feelings she had developed for me during our courtship, they could not compete with the deep love she felt for the man she had given up. Then that is what you should have, I said, rising to my feet with a sense of resolution that felt like freedom. I will speak with your brother about dissolving our arrangement. You should go to Thomas and tell him the truth about your situation. Allow him to make his own choice about what he can and cannot sacrifice for love. The transformation in her face was like watching the sun emerge from behind storm clouds. Hope and joy illuminated her features in a way that made her genuinely beautiful, not despite her physical limitations but transcending them entirely through the radiance of her happiness. Over the following days, I worked with Harold to restructure my debts and find alternative solutions to the estate's financial problems. It would be difficult and would require significant changes to how the family had lived for generations, but it was possible to survive without Cordelia's dowry. Meanwhile, Cordelia had traveled to the village where Thomas practiced medicine. Their reunion, she later told me, involved considerable tears, recriminations about her sacrifice, and ultimately a proposal that she accepted with the joy she had never shown about our arrangement. 6 months later, I attended their wedding in the small church where I had first seen her kindness to the village families. She was radiant with happiness, and Thomas proved to be exactly the kind of man who deserved her love. Intelligent, compassionate, and utterly devoted to her welfare. Watching them together, I felt no regret about the choice I had made. My own estate survived its financial difficulties through careful management and creative solutions. I eventually married for love several years later, to a woman who shared my interests in agricultural improvement and social reform. But I never forgot the lesson Cordelia taught me about the difference between duty and honor, between accepting what seems inevitable and fighting for what is right. Sometimes the greatest courage is not in accepting what we think we must bear, but in believing we deserve the happiness we are afraid to reach for. True love requires freedom to choose, not obligation to accept. When we allow ourselves and others to pursue genuine happiness rather than mere security, we often find that the practical problems we feared were insurmountable can be solved through determination and creativity. The choice to love freely, to refuse to build our happiness on others' sacrifices, to believe in possibilities rather than limitations. These are the choices that transform not just individual lives but entire families and communities. Love always finds a way to triumph over circumstances, but only when we have the courage to let it try. Subscribe for more stories that prove love, honor, and happiness can coexist when we have the courage to choose them over fear and convention.